Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the Russian-Ukrainian war. I have titled today's video, Battlefield Ukraine, Russian Shock and Awe. So why did I title today's content, Shock and Awe? Well, it appears that the Russians are continuing to forward deploy fairly significant amounts of fixed-wing aircraft. We anticipate that the Russians could be preparing to launch a very large aerial offensive against Ukraine. Right now, we believe that the Russians have moved up to 400 aircraft, possibly less, possibly more. The majority of those aircraft are air-to-ground strike systems, such as approximately 100 Su-34s, fullbacks. Those are the deep penetration strike aircraft that would give the Russians the capability of hitting key bridges across the NEPA River. In addition, other aircraft, such as Su-24, older strike air-to-ground strike aircraft, some of which have been upgraded, and then obviously the Su-25 ground support aircraft, which can also hit larger ground targets as well, such as bridges, command posts, and supply depots. And then supporting those strike aircraft, in all probability, will be 100, maybe more, Su-30s, Su-27s, Su-35s, and quite possibly we could see additional resources, such as newer variants of the older MiG-29, MiG-35 that have been upgraded and are now using more advanced targeting pods. And then obviously as well the Su-57, the most capable strike aircraft, air-to-air aircraft in the Russian inventory. Now, the Russians have very few of those systems, quite possibly at most 10 to 12 of these systems deployed against the Ukrainians and have been forward deployed. But nonetheless, we believe they will be using those stealth aircraft to conduct operations against the Ukrainians, probably more aggressive operations than we've seen the Su-57 being deployed in the past as well. But the force that is being compiled is significant, again, upwards to 300 plus variations of strike aircraft. And it appears that the Russians could be preparing to sever the land capability for the Ukrainians to cross the NEPA River. Now, I've talked about early in the war that I would have anticipated the Russians to do that in the early stages of the conflict. And this is one key issue that I think has been mystifying a lot of military observers in this ongoing war. Why haven't the Russians eliminated the ability of the Ukrainian army to supply itself in the field in eastern Ukraine, especially when you have a large terrain feature such as a very, very large river that basically breaks the country in half, with maybe less than a dozen or less bridges that cross this vast river. And we're just heading up from south to north up the NEPA River, where you also have very large lakes in some areas as well, man-made lakes. So again, we could be getting ready to see the first concerted effort by Russian forces to sever the Ukrainian ability to cross the NEPA River in any sort of meaningful way, meaning to deploy large brigade-sized formations from western Ukraine into eastern Ukraine. Now, if the Russians are successfully able to sever the crossing points of the NEPA River, this would prevent additional supplies from getting into eastern Ukraine. Now, we do know that the Ukrainians have been massing stores of valuable supplies, fuel, weapons, ammunition in eastern Ukraine, especially in some of the larger cities in eastern Ukraine. We have talked about the fact that we hear the mainstream media talking about Russians attacking Ukrainian cities. Well, the Russians are attacking Ukrainian cities because the Ukrainians put military infrastructure, military units in those cities. Now, again, in the defense of the Ukrainians, makes perfect sense. What else are the Ukrainians to do other than putting military supply depots, military units in open fields and camps, which would make them much more easier to be targeted? Again, it is just the nature of war. And when you have these very large super cities like Kharkov, maybe not a super city such as Zaporizhia, in other areas such as Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, the Ukrainians, are going to use those cities as defensive redoubts. But we've seen over the course of the last several weeks the Russians targeting a lot of that infrastructure, a lot of that supply infrastructure in eastern Ukraine, and we could be getting ready to see the culmination of those efforts with the Russian Air Force. I would say possibly a top 10 Air Force in the world. If we look at Air Forces, if we look at the top Air Forces on the planet, I would say obviously the United States military has beyond a shadow of a doubt, has the most capable Air Force on the planet. Next, it becomes debatable in terms of infrastructure, training, the ability to service and deploy combat jets, technology. Some would say it's the Chinese that hold the spot of number 2, and I could probably do a whole nother video on top 10 Air Forces, but I'm going to discuss it here. Next, in terms of going to the number 3 to the number 10 spot, very difficult to say. I would say that Israel is absolutely in that top 10. I would say the French Air Force is in that top 10. I would say Japan, South Korea is in that top 10. Some people would put India. I would not say that. I believe the Indian Air Force has significant issues, especially with the varying types of Eastern and Western aircraft. We've seen supply issues. We've seen maintenance issues with the Indian Air Force. I would not categorize the Indian Air Force as top 10. Namely because of quality, not quantity. Look, you can have quantity, but that doesn't mean your overall capability has a qualitative edge. I would probably say, without a doubt, the Israeli Air Force exceeds capabilities of the Indian Air Force and many of some of the larger air forces in the world. Where is Russia? Possibly in top 10. It has not performed like a top 10 Air Force in this conflict. Now, is that to say that the Russian Air Force, the Russian military, is not adapting and changing its doctrine as this war continues? I would say, without a doubt, that is occurring. And I think a year from now, we will see a much different Russian Air Force. Well, I won't go far as to say a year. I would say 3 years from now, we will probably see a much different Russian Air Force. But we do know the Russian Air Force is modifying, it is adapting to modern conditions. And I think the Russian Air Force command staff, I think the Russian general staff understands that it needs to rapidly advance its Air Force. It has to look like and act like a Western Air Force, especially, as I've talked about this before, in regarding precision strike ability and long-range targeting pods, which we have not seen the Russians deploy in the types of numbers needed to be successful in this conflict, especially in regards to interdicting Ukrainian ground units moving from point A to point B. Haven't seen it yet. Now, with this upcoming possible aerial offensive by the Russian Air Force, we could see that start to change. So again, I would suspect that the Russians have decided to make a concerted effort to degrade and destroy the Ukrainian ability to cross the NEPA River. This is going to be something eventually the Russians are going to have to do, or at least try to do. Now, is it something that they don't have the capability to do, or is it an issue that they're just not willing to do at this point? Difficult to say. It doesn't make any sense for me as an observer to believe the Russians could not look at this conflict and say to themselves, we've got to sever transportation efforts over the NEPA River. Hasn't been done. So will we see it in the upcoming days and weeks ahead as the Russians continue to mass its air force for what some believe to be the largest aerial offensive since the start of the war? Quite possibly. Quite possibly, but only time will tell. But that pretty much covers it for this Sunday. I hope everyone has a pleasant remainder of their weekend, has a most pleasant Sunday, and look forward to producing more content in the hours to come. Stay tuned. More is on the way. And as always, have a good day.